couple of notes as we begin today. We're going to be in the Bible in two different places, and I always invite you to follow along. It may be particularly helpful this time around. We're going to be in Leviticus 16 to begin with, and then partway through the sermon we're going to be in Hebrews 10. So you've got both of them listed there. If you want to follow along, I want to encourage you to do so. Leviticus is toward the beginning of the Old Testament, the beginning of the Bible, and Hebrews is actually toward the back of the New Testament, toward the back of the Bible. So if you want to mark both of those spots, Leviticus 16 and Hebrews 10, and maybe if you have your own Bible, you can even underline it in the places where we see the overlap between these two scriptures. We're in the middle of a series of sermons where, we just started last week actually, where we're looking into the Old Testament to try and find Jesus. To try and find where we see Jesus. We read the Bible through the lens of Jesus Christ, and so we know that when we look into the Old Testament, we can expect to find him there. It's not always easy to find him there, but that's what we're hoping to do. And today, we pick up where we left off last week. Remember, Adam and Eve were put into the Garden of Eden, and everything was wonderful, and they were given one command, though, don't eat of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. But they did. Now, the consequence, God had already pre-told Adam and Eve. He said that if you eat of this tree, you'll die. But they don't die. And therein, we begin to see the hope that God will restore people unto himself, that God will make a way to make things right. And we know, of course, that way is Jesus Christ. So we see him way back in Genesis 3. But that hope begins to be refined as we go further into the Old Testament, and it becomes refined as God gives Moses the law. Now, for those of you who are not familiar with this concept, the first 5 books in the Bible, Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy, are called the Old Testament the law, especially by Jewish people. Those are considered law. There's another word for it in Hebrew called Torah. You may have heard the Old Testament, especially these first 5 books, referred to as Torah. It means law. And the law was given to us for several reasons, depending on which reformer you're reading. But at least this, that the law convicts us of sin. So between Adam and Moses, the Israelites could justifiably say, hey, we have no idea whether or not we're committing sin. There's no rules. Now, I would say that their heart probably led them to know whether what they're doing is right or wrong. But, you know, if you're arrested for a crime that is not actually, there's no law against it, you can say, hey, come on now, I haven't committed any crime. There's no law in the books against this. And so God refines the hope that he's given to his people by giving them law, by giving them boundaries of an appropriate life to live in. And now they know in the times when they've stepped outside those boundaries. But the law not only convicts us of sin, as we'll see today, it also provides a way to atone for sin. Now that's a theology word, but atone means to make right, or the way in which God forgives us of sin. So we're going to see today how the sacrificial system of the Old Testament made atonement, even if it's temporary, made atonement for the people of Israel. In fact, we're reading from Leviticus 16. Now I know that you guys are probably not thinking, all right, Leviticus, we get to read Leviticus today. But Leviticus 16 is the Day of Atonement. You may have heard this before. If you're familiar with any Jewish people, this is a very important day. It's called Yom Kippur, the Day of Atonement. And it was such an important day that all the other days of the Jewish calendar centered around this day, around this ritual, because this ritual, at least for this day, made all of Israel right with God. It made them clean. It made them holy before him. And so they built their entire calendar around Yom Kippur, the Day of Atonement. In fact, they began to call it simply the day. That's how important it was. It was the day. The Day of Atonement. And so as we read from Leviticus 16, you'll hear the ceremony that happens on this day. Let me just briefly go through it so that you can flag those points as we read them today. The main character, so to speak, in this ritual is the high priest, in this case Aaron. And the high priest, there's only one of them in Israel. Why? Well, because Israelites, like all of us, are sinful people. And when sinful things mix with holy things, it's disastrous. We see cities being consumed, people being killed. All the time when sin comes in contact with the holy God, it's like lighting a match and throwing it into a gunpowder factory. It just doesn't work. You can't mix sinful things with holy things. So God allows for this one man in a very specific way, after he's atoned for his own sin. You'll see this. He has to kill a bull. He has to kill a bull to atone for his sin and the sin of his family before he can undertake this office. But he does, and then he takes a bath, he puts on his holy robes, and then he takes 2 goats to atone for the sin of all of Israel. And he takes them into this holy place in the temple. And he does a divine version of eeny, meeny, miny, mo. And they cast lots to see which goat gets which fate. One of the goats will receive all the sins of Israel on his head and be cast out into the wilderness. This is called casting him out to Azalel. Now that sounds like a strange god. It's not, though. It's just simply the field where they let the goats go. But this goat symbolized the sin leaving Israel, running away out of the wilderness. So God casting that sin away. The other goat, though, the other goat was not so lucky. The other goat was the sacrifice for sin. And Aaron killed that goat, slit his throat, and drained his blood there in the temple. Now imagine this. You're an Israelite on the Day of Atonement standing outside the temple, and you know that what's happening in there is that a goat is slowly dying because you sinned. In its best sense, it breaks your heart. And that's the point of it, to cause us to have this broken heart before God. And in the midst of all this ritual and blood and gore and glory, we're asking this question, where's Jesus in the midst of all this? We really need Jesus in the midst, and we're looking desperately for him because some of this we don't understand unless there's some other piece. And so we look today, and we begin with Leviticus chapter 16. Let's read. Beginning at the first verse, the Lord spoke to Moses after the death of the 2 sons Aaron, when they drew near before the Lord and died. The Lord said to Moses, "Tell your brother Aaron not to come just at any time into the sanctuary inside the curtain before the mercy seat that is upon the ark, or he will die. For I appear in the cloud upon the mercy seat. Thus shall Aaron come into the holy place with a young bull for a sin offering and a ram for a burnt offering. He shall put on the holy linen tunic and shall have the linen undergarments next to his body, fasten the linen sash, and wear the linen turban. These are holy vestments. He shall bathe his body in water and then put them on. He shall take from the congregation of the people of Israel 2 male goats for a sin offering and 1 ram for a burnt offering. Aaron shall offer the bull as a sin offering for himself, and shall make atonement for himself and for his house. He shall take the 2 goats and set them before the Lord at the entrance of the tent of meeting, and Aaron shall cast lots on the 2 goats, 1 lot for the Lord and the other lot for Azalel. Aaron shall present the goat on which the lot fell for the Lord and offer it as a sin offering. But the goat on which the lot fell for Azalel shall be presented alive before the Lord to make atonement over it, so that it may be sent away into the wilderness to Azalel. And now I move forward to the 30th verse. After the ritual has taken place, we're given this promise. For on this day atonement shall be made for you, to cleanse you from all your sins. You shall be clean before the Lord. This is the word of the Lord. Thanks be to God. If you've ever been in an Old Testament class, I imagine many of you have studied the Old Testament in group settings before. If you haven't, you probably will. If you've ever studied the Old Testament in a group setting, there's always that one person in the class, and maybe it's you, who says this: goodness, the God of the Old Testament, that's a mean God, isn't it? And I can certainly understand that feeling, but I want to argue that the God of the Old Testament is not a mean God. Okay? And let me begin by saying this. This book, the Bible, is what we Christians believe, right? We believe what it says to be true about God. We believe what it says to be true about us. And what this Bible tells us, not only in the Old Testament, but also in the New, it's throughout, is that the penalty for sin is death. Now the question becomes, do we believe that? Because additionally, the scriptures tell us that all have sinned and fallen short of the glory of God. And so as we look back into the Old Testament, God is not a mean God. He's just. Every time he executes a person, it's not being mean, it's being just. We wouldn't look at a judge who sentences a rapist for the rest of his natural life in prison and say, well, you're a mean judge. We'd say, no, you're a just judge. You've executed justly, you've executed justice well. And so as we look to the Old Testament and see that God sometimes does kill people and destroy cities, it's not that he's mean, it's that he's doing what God has said he'd do. He's executing justice. But the amazing part is not really that he executes justice, but that he also holds out mercy. That there are some who do indeed live, and he does begin to provide a way for them to be in relationship with him. That's really the amazing part. I think people miss this because they underestimate the intensity of sin. I think that so many Christians in our culture just basically think about God and they think, well, when I get to heaven, it'll be kind of like Santa Claus. Ho, 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 welcome to heaven. I'm so glad you took care of that homeless person and you fed that poor person. You know what? I'm so happy with you that I'm just going to look past the sex you had that was outside of marriage. I'm just going to look past when you dishonored your parents. Those laws I set down, they don't really matter. But friends, if that's your God, that's a silly little God. That's not the God revealed in the Bible. The God that's revealed in these pages, it says that the earth trembles at his presence. This is a holy God. And any infraction against his holiness is a destruction of the very fabric of goodness. But you know what? Amazingly, there's this other aspect of God. Not only is he holy, but by grace, he is also merciful. And he begins to create a way for sinful people to be in relationship with a holy God. Remember, we said that those things don't mix well together. Something has to happen if sinful people are going to come into relationship with a holy God. And so God provides a way. And beginning in the Old Testament, beginning here with Leviticus, he provides atonement. Remember? A process through which sins are forgiven. And so I think it's important for us to talk about that process. What God says in Leviticus is that when an animal is sacrificed, he'll forgive the sin. Now, the same person that's in your Old Testament class would also say this, well, that's awful. I mean, Catherine said that too. That's awful. God must be bloodthirsty. God must be twisted. Well, I will agree that it's awful. But it's not God who's bloodthirsty. And it's not God who's twisted. It's us. The sacrificial system serves as a mirror that we look into. And we see what our sin costs us. When we know that a goat is having its blood slowly drained and dying because I sinned. My heart is broken. Okay, and that's the point. Now it's also important to draw this line because it's not that God needs dead animals. God doesn't need a bunch of bulls and goats that are sacrificed. He makes that really clear in the prophets and the Psalms. The point of the whole system is that you might have a broken heart over sin. That you might be like God when he looks at your sin and has his heart broken. You too can share in that brokenness of heart. And the good news is ultimately that at the bottom of that broken heart, we find forgiveness. Now we also know that the Old Testament